invite or recognize Governor Sanford. And I know with your experience in the House that you recognize how important it's going to be for our governors and even our mayors to bring together their congressional delegations and to try to show how important in a bipartisan way that this Congress has to come back and ease the pain of your constituents, which is the backbone of everything that we want to do for our great country. But as Mr. McQuarrie has said, we're going to need your help to make certain that it is a package in which the President is willing to sign. I now recognize Mr. Governor Sanford, and it's good to see you back in your old house.
Pleasure to be back, sir. Chairman Rangel, Congressman McQuarrie, members of the committee, and former colleagues, thank you indeed for the chance to testify. I very much appreciate it. I have a longer set of prepared remarks, written testimony that I'd like to submit for the record that more substantively goes to the points that you raised in your opening comments, Mr. Chairman. But in the interest of time, since I've only got 5 minutes, let me boil down what those comments say. And what they say is, I very much admire the intentions of the committee, but I am here to respectfully beg of this committee not to approve a $150 billion stimulus package going forward for the unintended consequences that I think it would bring to my home state of South Carolina, to all states, to the nation as a whole, and for that matter, to my boys, y'all's grandkids, your kids. And I would say that really, I guess, tied to 5 different points. I would say, one, if you go ahead with this, the question I think ultimately has to be asked, who bails out the bailoutor? And I raise that point because we need to remember we're not talking about taking money out of a bank. In this case, we're talking about borrowing more money from Social Security, borrowing more money from Medicare, borrowing indeed money from our kids and grandkids, borrowing more money from the Chinese, where we've already borrowed approximately $500 billion worth. And I think that there's some irony in borrowing more to deal with a problem that was ultimately created by excessive borrowing. And I think that there are a lot of different ways that you could get at this. Probably one of the simplest would be a conversation that I had a couple of months ago with David Walker, who was the past Comptroller General of the United States of America. He left that post to join up with Warren Buffett and a variety of others in a group trying to raise awareness on the problem going forward in the accumulated $52 trillion worth of liability this country has. And I said, why are you going? He says, as I see it, we only have about 10 years, and after that it is a pure math trap with regard to what comes next. He likened it to fiscal child abuse, and I have a chart here. This is not a reading test for you, Chairman Rangel, but it gets at the point of the numbers have been rising rapidly. We're now at about $52 trillion of unpaid for political promises, and I think the idea of adding more borrowings at this time would be problematic. I would submit that for the record as well. I would secondly say, do you have to be a financial or a fiscal bad guy to win these days? That is a question that's increasingly being asked when I travel around in our state, because there are a lot of folks that had question marks, real problems with the bailout of Wall Street, among them, for instance, community bankers. And what they say is, we live by the rules, we were careful in our underwriting process, we look very carefully at the credit, and yet the banks that didn't do that are the ones that are getting federal aid, and in fact they're going to have competitive advantage against me as a local community bank based on the unintended consequence that came with this help. Same is being said at a more local level. You know, Amity Shalali's wrote a book called The Forgotten Man, talking about that forgotten man in the Great Depression who was just struggling to survive. And a lot of folks are telling me, I feel like that forgotten man. I didn't buy too much house, I didn't take on too much mortgage, and yet the person across the street that did is the person being rewarded. At the state level, that same phenomenon exists. I have 2 more charts that I'd submit here for the record. This is growth in spending, the blue line being federal government, the red line being states. And the irony here is, as many people who oftentimes complain about the fiscal irresponsibility of the federal government, in fact, the only group that has been more fiscally irresponsible, in fact, have been states, because states have grown at a higher rate of growth in terms of spending than the federal government has. And that's the average look. If you were to look at it on a state-by-state basis, just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, over the last 10 years, the federal government has grown by 71%. If you contrast that, for instance, Wyoming has grown by 250%, their state government. Alaska has grown by 143%, roughly double that of the federal government. California, that's asking for help, it grew by 95%, again, well ahead of the growth rate of the federal government. And so again, I think that there is some unintended consequence that comes to the states that have been more fiscally prudent if we bail out those that haven't been such on that front. Thirdly, I would point, and I will mercifully spare you another reading chest or chart. Herb Stein once said that if something won't go on forever, it'll stop. Fairly profound, fairly simple. And if you think about, for instance, a federal state program like Medicaid, it's grown on average across all states in this country at 9.5% over the last 10 years, 9.5% every year. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that if you grow one program at 9.5% and the underlying economy is growing by about 3%, you're going to have problems come sometime down the road. We are going to have to make reforms and changes to any number of these federal-state partnerships for them to be sustainable. And if we simply add more money at this time and in essence bail out in what are in some cases unsustainable programs, I think that we end up with real problems down the road. Fourthly, I would say remember the cows. I'm not talking about cows in your congressional district or in my state, but I'm going back to, Pharaoh's dream there in the Bible that was interpreted. As you may remember, there were 7 fat cows coming out of the Nile, and there were 7 skinny cows coming out of the Nile. As long as history has been around, there's been an up and down cycle to times of feast and times of famine. And I think that what we got to remember here in this case, when times are good, people generally get ahead of themselves. Debt has grown at 4 times GDP over the last 15 years. And what we have done as a country is to say, rightfully, and again, I admire the intent of the committee and the intent of the Congress, we want to do something about that. If you add up all the different bailouts and pieces of economic stimulus over the last year, it adds to $2.3 trillion, about $21,000 per household. And yet, we are still where we are. And the question I think that has to be asked is, would another $150,000 make the difference on what comes next? And I would submit this chart for the record as well. What it shows is $150 billion of stimulus is 1/5 of 1% of world GDP. We are now dealing with a global issue, a global problem based on what's happened in the credit and financial markets that has rippled into every one of our main streets and hometowns. But we need to remember that the overall global economy is $67 trillion. The U.S. economy is $14 trillion. And $150 billion, when we've already submitted $2.3 trillion to try and effect change on this front, I don't think at the end of the day will be enough. Fifthly, I would finally say, and I just might add one point on that. The fact that it won't be enough, I think, is telling in bank deposits. If you were to look at July 2nd of this year, banks held $14 billion in deposits in balance with the Federal Reserve. October 1st of this year, they hold $167 billion in balances there at the Federal Reserve. So in fact, though a lot of money has been put in the street, in fact, given the nature of man, given the history of cycles, at times people are going to slow up regardless of how much money you put into the system. And finally, I would simply say this. Would you give the soldier the keys? And I'd say this to you very specifically, Chairman Rangel. If you think about your service to the United States military, it was none other than heroic back in the Korean War. I mean, you earned a Purple Heart in the service of your country. And I think that what you know in seeing that process unfold is that regardless of the training, regardless of the length of the training, at some point at the training's end, you got to give the keys to that sailor, the soldier, the airman, the Marine. And at a federal, state level, we don't do that. There are a lot of states out there still with training wheels based on federal mandates. So what I would submit to you is that there is something that can be done that would be very helpful to $28 million each year that we deal with in our budget process that are tied to federal unfunded mandates. And if you were looking to help states, one of the ways that I think would make the biggest difference is either to free us or to fund those unfunded mandates, and those would be my quick thoughts within the 5-minute context that I've got. Thank you, sir.
Before I recognize Mayor Palmer, could I ask you, Governor, whether you supported the efforts of the President and the Congress in rescuing the $700 billion problem faced by our financial institutions?
I apologize. I was speaking with the Governor.
That's okay.
He had something to say, and we were being neighborly here as fellow governors. I apologize. I didn't hear the first part of that question.
Recently, the President asked and the Congress complied with a $700 billion rescue, bailout, whatever. Did you support that effort?
I did not.
Okay.